Hi, everyone. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me take this opportunity to thank our partners, Yale and Brown Clubs of Washington, D.C., and their members for joining us this evening. Today, we are so fortunate to have Jon Ronson, author, screenwriter, filmmaker, and journalist, to discuss public shaming and the newer variety, cancel culture. If you have not read it, I would recommend reading his highly acclaimed book on the topic, So You Have Been Publicly Shamed. Our host will be no other than Adam B. Kushner, Outlook editor at Washington Post. Please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers, but I do encourage everyone to check our site to see their full bios and references to their body of work. Jon Ronson is a British-American journalist and a documentary filmmaker whose works include The Men Who Stare at Goats, which has been made into a blockbuster movie, as many of you know, the Psychopath Test, which spent more than a year on the UK's bestseller list. His books have been translated into 30 languages, and his 2 TED Talks have been watched 30 million times over. In the US, Jon is a contributor to This American Life, the New York Times Magazine, and GQ Magazine. He lives in upstate New York and became an American citizen this year. Our host, Adam Kushner, is the editor of Outlook, the Washington Post's home for ideas, essays, arguments, and book criticism. Previously, he was the editor of National Journal Magazine, a senior editor for Foreign Affairs and Newsweek, and a managing editor at The New Republic. Mr. Kushner has a BA from Columbia University. Adam, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Kambiz. Thanks for having us. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Jon. I think this is a really interesting moment to be talking about your book and reprising some of the themes because it has amazing relevance today, a way that maybe you think has changed. We can get into that both online and in the culture and in the presidential campaign. But I wonder if we can start maybe by, if I can just ask you to give the sort of potted 45-second summary of So You've Been Publicly Shamed, which I absolutely loved reading. I know every author loves to reduce years of work to less than a minute, but I think it's a really good way to situate our discussion today. So maybe you can just kind of give the quick contours.
Okay. Well, it's a book about how I think I noticed before. By the way, can you hear me okay? Good. I noticed quite early on that there were problems with the new type of justice that was happening on social media. And I understood why people wanted to try and better the old justice system, but it felt like a whole new bunch of mistakes were being made. And as a journalist who believes in curiosity and patience and I guess empathy and compassion wherever possible, it was kind of dispiriting to see those things being considered weaknesses. So the book is about the growth of social media shaming. I interviewed some of the world's most shamed people, and I contextualize it with history and psychology and social science and so on. But mainly it's about what happens to people after they've been shamed and why are we doing it.
And the great primary case study in your book is this woman, Justine Sacco. Maybe you can just tell, for those who haven't read the book or may not remember this bit of internet arcana from years ago, what she did and what happened to her.
Sure, she was the really the ground zero of public shaming. It's interesting. I've been a writer. I was thinking this just before we came on because I haven't talked about this book for a little while, and I've been a writer for 35 years and I've written so many stories, but I can say at this moment in my life, the story I'm about to tell is the story that people most want me to tell. Almost in like a sort of Brothers Grimm type way, I think.
It's a fable, yeah.
Yeah, it's a fable. So Justine Sacco is kind of the ground zero of shaming. This happened in December 2013. Nothing like what I'm about to say had ever happened before. She had 170 Twitter followers, not a great Twitter persona. She was kind of brittle, trying to be like South Park and not being very good at it. So she's flying from New York to Cape Town, and she's tweeting these, ever so slightly offensive tweets, like, German guy with halitosis sitting in first class, go and clean your teeth. It's not somebody that you'd love on Twitter. And then she gets to Heathrow, has a couple of minutes to spare before boarding a plane to Cape Town, and tweets, going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white. And she chuckled to herself and pressed send and got no replies. She never got any replies because she was basically a comedian telling jokes in an empty room. She had like no followers. So she falls asleep on the plane, wakes up in Cape Town, turns on her phone, and straight away there was a text from somebody that she hadn't spoken to since high school that said, I am so sorry to see what's happening to you right now. And then another text came up from her best friend saying, you need to phone me right now. You are the worldwide #1 trending topic on Twitter. So while she'd slept, it began because one of her followers sent the tweet to Sam Biddle, who was a journalist on Gawker, and he retweeted it. She was a PR woman for IAC. So she was, she had a public presence. So somebody tweeted it to Sam Biddle, he retweeted it to his 15,000 followers, and then it just, what was so interesting, well, so many things were interesting to me that night. One of them was the fact that this was a shaming that everybody could get behind. She was being, while she slept, completely oblivious, she was being torn to shreds by Trump. He went for her, misogynists on the right, lots of social justice people on the left, hipsters. It was a huge hipster thing. Somebody figured out which plane she was on, and so they linked to a flight tracker website, and so everybody was like sitting in bars, like the Truman Show. Everyone was sitting in bars, and people were tweeting, I can't wait to, I want to go home to bed, but I just can't leave this bar until Justine Sacco lands. The whole world knew something that she didn't know, that her life had been blown up, and that was hilarious to people. The fact that she was oblivious to her destruction, the fact that she'd been tried and sentenced and convicted without her even knowing that there had been a trial was hilarious to people. And then, of course, well, maybe not of course, but it didn't take me very long to figure out that her joke wasn't intended to be racist. She was making a self-reflexive joke about her own privilege. I felt a la Randy Newman. Randy Newman's written a bunch of songs in that genre. And I'm sure lots of the people who tore into her realised that too, but they decided to just ignore it because something else was happening that night.
Right. So this comedian who thought she was joking to an empty room suddenly realizes only after the fact that she's spoken to the entire world, which has completely misconstrued what she said and was afforded no opportunity to defend herself. She lost her job, right? She struggled to find a new one. Where is she today? Do you know?
Yeah, so when she eventually did get a new job, after like a year in purgatory for the crime of a poorly worded liberal joke, Twitter found out and tried to get her fired all over again. One thing Twitter hasn't, that aspect of Twitter hasn't figured out, I think, is the importance of re-entry in justice. So now she's back at the old company after a couple of years, but I refuse to say that Justine Sacco's story is a case of cancel culture doesn't exist, just look, she's back in her old job, because it was devastating what happened to her. Mentally, it was devastating. She lost her job. She wouldn't forever be the AIDS tweet woman. So she's not a poster child for cancel culture not existing.
And insofar as it is a fable, her story also touched the rest of us. Your book is a sort of lament for this universe in which we all are complicit in mob justice, and also ourselves have to be very careful about what we say and how we say it, which was really, really interesting to me. One thing I found sort of challenging, both reading your book and also following what's happening now, was knowing where to draw the line between understanding and empathy, compassion, these values you talk about, forgiveness. You've reported on sort of two classes of people. I would say, maybe you disagree with my taxonomy, but hear me out. Folks who were misunderstood, like Justine Sacco, and then folks who genuinely did something bad, like our own Columbia's own graduate, Jonah Lehrer, who made up a bunch of quotes and did some other shoddy work cutting corners to support his very, very successful, preternaturally early pop science journalism career. You sort of rue what happened to all these people. And clearly, if there were a mechanism to redeem people like Sacco and give them reentry, we would want her welcomed back from pariah status. But, what do you think is owed by us to people like Lehrer, whose sin was clearly intentional and considered, or Amy Cooper, that woman who called the cops and lied that the African-American birder in Central Park was hitting her? Do you think even for them, the mob should relax already, or what?
Well, I mean, it's not an exact science, is the obvious main answer to that question. To talk about Amy Cooper for a minute, I think I disappointed a lot of my readers by every time somebody gets shamed, and it's happened for the last 5 years, I've become Mr. Shame. I've become as a friend of mine said, I've become a shaming imam. I awake to...
What is your jurisprudence on this case? Yeah,
exactly. I awake to 50 tweets, looking forward to seeing what Jon Ronson has to say about this, which, I should tell you, I hate. Like, that's not something that I want in my life. And I tend
poor thing to be considered an important authority on a topical issue.
I think it's because journalists, we don't want to, I'm very reluctant to be pigeonholed in a particular subject matter. I think that's the reason why I think that there's a danger to it, particularly this subject, because you end up being a Harper's signatory, and that's a bad place to end up, I would say. So I disappointed a lot of my readers by not being sympathetic to Amy Cooper. I felt that what she had done was really serious. She could have got a guy killed, and so I felt I should say something about that one, and I effectively said that, because what I noticed was that people on both sides of the argument were using my book to justify their ideological positions. So people on the left would basically say, look at this terrible thing that Amy Cooper did. It just shows that, what Justine Sacco, obviously what Justine Sacco did was terrible. That was sort of their position, that all of these transgressions, are similarly bad, and we've got to have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to it. And then other people in the centre, the free speech centre, and on the right were saying, see, what they're doing to Amy Cooper is just as bad as what they did to Justine Sacco. So on both sides, there was a moral flattening that I found kind of irritating. Jonah Lehrer, he made his bed. I mean, there was a guy in Britain called James Ratner, who was the head of a huge chain of jewellery stores. And one day he gave an interview where he said that the jewellery that he sold, which was quite low quality jewellery for people who couldn't afford very expensive jewellery, was crap. And that was the end of Ratner's. And sometimes that's just the case. It's hard. I'm not saying that I want Jonah Lehrer to never recover, but I'm saying the ball is in his court and he has a lot of work to do. I also, though, slightly lament the fact that, again, people say, I saw something in the tablet just the other day that said Jonah Lehrer is a terrible example of cancel culture destroying lives because a year later he'd written another book and he's absolutely fine. The fact is, if Jonah Lehrer doesn't seem to have anything published in 7 years. So, this isn't, other than a book which nobody bought. So again, his punishment, especially in these days of Trump and fake news, is very harsh for his crimes being very stupid. But, he was adding words to a quote. So he quoted Bob Dylan as saying, there's a line in Pennebaker's Don't Look Back, where Bob Dylan is reading an article about himself smoking 6 packs of cigarettes a day. And Dylan looks up at the camera and says, I'm glad I'm not me. And Jonah Lehrer quoted it as, I'm glad I'm not me, I'm glad I'm not that. So that was the kind of thing that he was doing. But when Michael Moynihan, the intrepid writer, realized what was happening, Jonah just spiraled out of control, doubled down, lied, made up lies to try and mitigate the other lies. So in a way, the cover-up was worse than the crime.
That's interesting. I wonder about Amy Cooper also, if you can establish a principle where when one of these people who's been publicly shamed has done something where there is an identifiable victim, that victim maybe has a little bit more ability to dispense absolution and rehabilitation than a more diffuse crime like Jonah Lehrer and his, he had been a serial plagiarist and whatever. Michael Cooper, the person on whom she called the police, had said, "Oh, I think the mob went too far. Leave this poor woman alone already. She learned her lesson. She shouldn't lose her job." And that was interesting, considering a lot of, even empathetic and compassionate people had said, what a disastrous thing she did.
Yeah, and that was, heroic of him and great of him to do that. He handled the whole thing with real aplomb, and it's now brought out a very good comic book inspired by it. Yeah. Yeah, and it's really good. So yes, once Michael Cooper said that, I think things did calm down. I think it did have an effect. It did have an impact, and things did calm down. But I didn't love, I didn't want to see people harmed. I didn't want to see Amy Cooper harmed. But what annoyed me was how Amy Cooper was being weaponized by ideologues on both sides to justify their wider ideology, which I always think is a really troublesome place to be.
Everybody needs supports for their arguments. As the editor of an ideas section, I identify that problem very strongly. The book came out in 2015, or the book was out in 2015. I'm wondering if you think mob culture online has changed since then, and how?
I think it's got better in some ways, worse in other ways. I think, to blow my own trumpet slightly, I think my book coming out at the same time as Monica Lewinsky's TED Talk kickstarted a conversation. Until those two things happened in pretty much the same month, nobody was talking about this subject. And people started talking about it. So then when ambiguous shamings happened after that, it was a little bit more democratic. What happened to Justine Sacco was, usually she was Googled 40 times a month. That night, she was Googled 1,220,000 times. So it was 1,220,000 people yelling at one person. And when people nervously stuck their heads above the parapet and said that night, I'm not sure Justine Sacco deserves what she's getting, or can we just wait until her plane lands so we can find out what she meant? Though the flame was burning so hot that those people were also torn apart. Oh, well, you would say that you're just a privileged bitch too, and so on. So even journalists, even journalists who are supposed to be unafraid of speaking truth to power, were afraid of speaking truth to power that night when the power was Twitter. Twitter was scarier than anything that night. And so that's changed, I would say. These days, there's more of a conversation. People are more willing to point out the ambiguities. People are less frightened to put their heads above the parapet. There's still all manner of unfair shamings. You've got to remember, Twitter is the world's worst information sorting service. We're constantly tearing somebody to shreds and then 2 days later realizing that we got our facts all wrong. So those things still do happen. So I think a positive thing is that there's more of a conversation. And what is the cure for shame? It's empathy. So it's less destructive on the person's mental health if there's more of a to and fro debate.
You brought up Monica Lewinsky. I wonder if we could steer the conversation in that direction for a moment. The Me Too movement unfolded after your book, and now suddenly a bunch of men's careers ended when women spoke up about what those men had done to them. Charlie Rose, Eric Schneiderman, people like that. And in a lot of these cases, pressure mounted very quickly online to have them removed from their positions. Is this a more righteous version of the public shaming, or something else altogether? Maybe something closer to public justice in a world where statutes of limitation and unenthusiastic prosecutors make courtroom justice impossible?
Well, yes. I remember somebody on the left saying to me when my book first came out, she said, I've been thinking a lot about your book and I agree with you, but I think the one place where we should still be allowed justice is when it comes to sex crimes, because the courts are so historically terrible at dealing with them. And, so it occurred. So yeah, I mean, I think I feel the same way that every right-thinking person feels about Me Too, which is that at its heart is something extremely good, extremely positive, and about time. You will find on the edges more troubling miscarriages of justice. Quite often, the Me Too community tends to fix it itself. So I'm thinking of the Aziz Ansari story, where very quickly other denizens of Me Too said, no, he doesn't fit. And his career went on without too much of a...
It was an interesting episode because those people stuck up their heads and had the courage of their convictions to say, the pattern isn't right. And a lot of them did take it in the face the same way Justine Sacco's defenders did.
Yeah. No, that's true.
And then meanwhile, there are these marginal cases, these questionable cases, Al Franken or whatever, where people, it's hard to know. It's how does a movement police itself when it's not a coherent, concrete, organized thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it polices itself successfully on occasion, as with Aziz Ansari. And I've noticed the Shitty Media Men list has had quite a lot of backlash too.
Maybe we can explain. The Shitty Media Men list is an anonymous Google Doc that was created by this woman, Maura Donegal, I believe her name is, about, it was for low-level women in journalism, essentially the writing on the bathroom wall, a list that they could access of men who were thought to have or known to have committed sexual assault against other women in journalism, but had nevertheless risen to positions of power.
And not just sexual assault, so also, I mean, some people were on it for being verbally creepy.
Mm-hmm. And so the list of some very, very, very established journalism people leaked, and several of them lost their jobs. And of course, none of what had been there, unlike the way we would treat one of these stories, the Washington Post, none of it had been verified, documented, corroborated. And so there was a question of, is this accurate? Is this justice? Can you have justice without, verification? So I'm sorry, now you were going to talk about the Shitty Media Men list. I just wanted to contextualize it.
Sure. Well, I've noticed, I mean, obviously that was a more troubling case. I saw other things. I saw a particularly awful tweet, which again, though, got really shut down, where the woman said, she's got a Twitter account called the Unslut Project, and that her tweet was something like, if some innocent men go down as a result of Me Too, I'm cool with that. But, again, that was shut down from within the movement too. I am by no means saying that it's been entirely successful in self-policing, but I would also say for the people who are really critical of Me Too, because it's just this sort of amorphous thing without any rules, it has been, from what I can see, pretty successful in self-policing.
Would you say, I mean, your book sort of questioned the idea of whether there could be such a thing as mob justice, and I wonder if you might say now that, given what happened to Eric Schneiderman or whoever, that maybe was an instance of internet justice.
I'm frowning because I don't know, you're going to have to tell me who Schneiderman...
He's the New York State Attorney General who the Times put together a big report, and as soon as it came out, he resigned his position. Or Charlie Rose, somebody like that. I mean, gotcha. lots of figures.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But my book was never really. It's not like I've done and about face or my book was wrong about that stuff. My book was always very clear what it was against. It was against the disproportionate punishment of private individuals who really haven't done
And this is proportionate. Yeah.
Yeah, and Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter was just beginning as my book came out, so I wrote a little bit about it in the afterword for the paperback. And again, it's just, there's a world of difference between this video had come out of a pool party in Texas, and some white neighbors had called the cops, and these young black kids, teenagers in bikinis, were being held down on the floor by cops, and in poses not dissimilar to George Floyd, and that's a world away. I mean, it's you don't need to be ideological about this. It's just anyone with a sagacious mind.
Basic human feeling.
Yeah.
Today, we a lot of times when we talk about what's happening online, we use this phrase cancel culture, which of course encompasses a lot of other stuff as well. Would you say that that is a rough contemporary proxy for the trend that first interested you, or is this something else now?
No, I think, again, like, most thinking people, I've got some sympathy with people who are critical of cancel culture, but I feel it's not what I was writing about. And I'm quite often sort of bought into the debate, because people think that my book is also about cancel culture. But I think the two things are very different. And I actually feel it's a difficult position for me to be in, because quite a lot of the sort of free speech centrists who signed the Harper's letter, who I guess are sort of the sort of grand dames of cancel culture being a bad thing, were all fans of my book, and I've met them, and many of them, and I like them, and many other things that they write with I agree with, and so on. That's my caveats. But I think they're just completely wrong about this. When you write that Harper's letter, and two of the signatories are a young writer in Seattle called Katie Herzog, who wrote something for Alt Weekly about detransitioners, which was deemed transphobic and may well have been transphobic. But Seattle was covered in fly posters saying Katie Herzog's a transphobe, and she ended up fleeing Seattle and moving to an island. She's doing absolutely fine now, but that was brutal. Also on that list is J.K. Rowling, who's a political activist, who was getting involved in legislation and self-ID. And there was Barry Weiss. There's agent provocateurs who are deliberately provocative, and then none of those things are what I was talking about, and so
there is a case or two in your book that's sort of fuzzier on the line. The engineer in Texas who made a stupid joke about a dongle that was an illusion for a penis at a conference, and he was run out of his job. I think today we would say he was canceled for that.
That's very true. I should tell that story. So this is two guys who are this is probably the most difficult of all the stories in the book. It's two guys in a tech conference where, like, everybody in the room's male, pretty much. Tech, having such an imbalance, and they're whispering to each other these sort of Beavis and Butthead type jokes about dongles in response to what somebody's saying on the stage. And the woman sitting in front turns around, takes a photograph of them, and tweets it publicly, saying these guys are making, comments that are making me unsafe or whatever. So, the way she did it wasn't great. She could have privately complained to the organisers. They were fired, or one of the two men was fired, and then she got inundated with rape threats and death threats, and she was fired. He got a new job pretty much straight away, and to my knowledge, she never got a new job. She may still be out of work. So that's that story. Yeah, I'd say so. But Hank and the other guy, these weren't New York Times columnists. They were two guys whispering.
Is that an important distinction? Is that you have to be a person of repute who has sort of entered the arena to be a subject of cancellation, or what?
Well, I had to create my own rules when I was writing the book. But at one point, I just sort of with a panicked look on my face, thought, what am I against? Am I against satire? Like, no. Am I against journalism? Of course not. Am I against citizen journalism? No. I'm not against any of these things. I'm against the disproportionate punishment of private people who really haven't done very much wrong. But the thing is, I just think it's absurd. This might be because I lived in Britain for most of my life, where the media is horrific. It's constantly oppositional. It's very classist.
Not especially empathetic.
No, it's all about getting people. It's brutal. So I suppose, and I don't like it. I'm really against oppositional adversarial journalism. I think I just think it's a very strange way to judge a person, by cornering them and yelling at them. So I'm against it, but it's been a fact of life my entire career. So this is why I have very little sympathy for people who are popular columnists in America, who write something very provocative and then accuse the woke Stasi of cancelling them when they get criticised back.
And what about when that criticism leads to, what we're now calling deplatforming? When Charles Murray, the scholar, gets hounded off of a stage at Middlebury, or a provocateur, like you say, like Milo Yiannopoulos, has his campus talk canceled. I remember when I was a Columbia sophomore, protesters tried to deplatform the conservative activist Dinesh D'Souza, and there wasn't at that time on campus very much appetite beyond the radical fringe for that sort of maneuver, even though most people on campus obviously hated the guy's views. The president of Columbia, he's still the president, Lee Bollinger, even very controversially invited Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to come and speak there. Is deplatforming a form of acceptable response, would you say, to somebody who is issuing a provocation and is stating your political views of provocation?
Right. Well, I mean, instinctively, I flinch at stories of speakers being cancelled from colleges because it's evidently a slippery slope. I'll tell you one thing about deplatforming, though. It really works. A couple of months ago, Alex Jones went on a big rant against me.
This is a conspiracy theory bearing right-wing talk radio host.
Yes. And he's been deplatformed. I only knew because one person emailed me some hate mail. If this had happened before Alex was deplatformed, I've been writing about Alex for 20 years on and off, then I would have got a lot more than one bit of hate mail. So on the other hand, I can't feel bad about Alex Jones's deplatforming. He was putting people in danger. He said something about one of the parents of the Sandy Hook children, I think, posted his address and said, I'm going to have to go there myself to, ask some hard questions. When you start hounding the parents of children killed in school shootings,
He's sort of an easy example, though. Let's pick a hard one. What about Charles Murray, who's a tenured Harvard professor who has a theory about race and IQ that is extremely disputed by scholars and also by lay people, but he's out there making the case for his beliefs and writing new books and getting new contracts, and a sort of darling of some segments of the conservative media. Is this justice?
Well, I don't know the ins and outs of his particular story, but what I would say is that there is an afterlife for cancelled people that is beginning to burgeon, which is where they kind of double down. Some of the people who committed like one transgression that they then got very criticised for, but were otherwise pretty liberal left-wing.
Yes, the name for this phenomenon is Alex Berenson.
Okay.
Right. Have you seen him on Twitter? He's a COVID doubter, former New York Times reporter who has tripled and quadrupled down. Anyway, continue, please. I'm sorry.
But other people, like that woman, Katie Herzog, who I mentioned earlier, she ended up losing her job at The Stranger. I think The Stranger closed down because of COVID. And now she's got a Patreon with a very successful podcast where it's all about, cancel culture. It's all about the woke Stasi and so on. So there is the danger of, when you force somebody into that ghetto, it then swallows up their life, and they
Right.
just become a caricature of themselves.
You limit their choices, you funnel them in.
Yeah,
What do you think? I mean,
can I tell you the other unexpected byproduct that I've noticed? I wrote a book about psychopaths 10 years ago called The Psychopath Test. And I noticed this was in response to the Ralph Northam case, the Virginia governor who was wearing blackface and then refused to resign. And everybody was saying, everyone was saying he should resign. He was like, no, I'm not going to resign. So everyone just went away. And a Democratic strategist was interviewed in the New York Times about it. And he said, maybe we've been doing it wrong for the last 100 years. Don't show remorse, just move, everyone will move on. And I thought what you're advocating here is for people to behave more psychopathically, for people to refuse to empathize with their critics, refuse to have any remorse.
I don't want to call him a psychopath, but I mean, not admitting to shame is sort of the primary defense mechanism of the president.
Yes, absolutely. And I think people are taking a leaf out of his book. I mean, in my psychopath book, I talked about how when you've got a president of a corporation is psychopathic, it trickles down and everybody behaves a little bit more psychopathically in the company. It would be wrong to diagnose the president, but that kind of thing seems to be happening in the GOP.
That's really interesting. Can we zoom out from these particular cases? I want to ask you about sort of the culture writ large. I'm wondering if you think we've become, we as consumers and participants have become too timid about controversial views. Our attendees here tonight with the Columbia Alumni Association, they know that the Columbia University marching band, whose entire writ was to make fun of self-serious, irreverent marching bands and to give these offensive jokes, it announced this month that it would be dissolving. It sounds like they didn't think they could survive making stupid race jokes and gay jokes and all the rest in this political climate. In some ways, I don't know, is this a sort of lamentable development, or is it maybe a good thing finally to be able to exclude certain kinds of commentary from the debate? What do you think about stuff like that?
Well, again, my feelings are mixed. I grew up in Britain in the 1970s and 80s, where everything on TV pretty much was racist or misogynistic or homophobic. And it was, it was not a nice way to spend a Saturday night watching these, boorish comedians telling racist jokes. So I've never felt against political correctness because I've seen how much better television has got since I was a child and so on. But on the other hand, as I write and say, being publicly shamed, the great thing about social media was how it gave a voice to voiceless people, but now we're turning it into a place where the smartest way to survive is to be bland. The reason why I came to that conclusion was because I took a shamed person called Lindsay Stone to a reputation rebuilder company. What they do is they try and game the Google algorithms. So they write fake blogs for somebody to push the newspaper articles about whatever transgression had occurred down and down to a place where nobody looks, which is page 2 of the Google search results. So,
sad
so what they
commentary on our attentive focus as news consumers. But go on.
Yeah. So with Lindsay, what they did was her transgression. She was actually pretty much torn apart by the right. So she was a care worker. Lovely woman, works with adults with learning difficulties in somewhere near Cape Cod, my memory. And she was taking a bunch of the people who she worked with to DC, took them to the Holocaust Museum, to the Mint, took them to Arlington. And at Arlington, she noticed a sign. Now, she had a running joke with her friends on Facebook that they would stand in front of a sign and do the opposite to what was happening on the sign. So they'd stand on the grass in front of a sign saying, keep off the grass or whatever. So at Arlington, they saw the sign that said silence and respect, and she posed like this. So anyway, she was torn to bits and lost her job.
Juvenile but harmless.
Yeah. Yes, of course. And, She lost her job and so on, went into a terrible tailspin. She stayed up every night reading. She was completely unequipped. You and I would say, would be more equipped to deal with this, but she was completely ill-equipped. So she stayed up all night, every night, reading every tweet and believing every criticism about her. They all snicked into her head and really impacted her mental health. Anyway, I took her to a reputation place, and what they did was they created all of these fake Lindsay Stone blogs about her love of cats and ice cream and how much she was looking forward to Lady Gaga's forthcoming jazz album, and so on. And it was a melancholy thing to witness, that what Reputation.com was proving was that even though social media was all about giving a voice to people who didn't have a voice, the smartest way to survive is to go back to being voiceless or being bland. So, in answer to your question, I have mixed feelings. I'm very glad that the media is a lot better than it used to be. At the same time, I worry, and I notice it in myself, I'm sure everybody does, that everybody's just a bit more timid, or like Princess Diana,
I certainly am. I don't even have a particularly ribald sense of humor, but the only thing I tweet are the headlines from the pieces I produce in my section and at the newspaper.
Right.
Safer. I even though I consume Twitter, and you sort of professionally, you have to.
Yeah. I wonder if that'll change. I wonder if there'll be a backlash against that, because nobody's really happy with that. I wonder.
I think my own opinion is that we have a secular trend here, and that it's only kind of becoming reaffirmed and becoming a norm. For people to be careful. You write, the last line of your book is, we're defining the boundaries of normality by tearing apart the people outside of it. I think about that and about the chilling effect online.
I noticed, yeah. Although one thing I did notice, in defense of me saying about maybe it might change a bit, is that Dave Chappelle Netflix special, which was, brutalized by all critics because they wanted to show that they were on the right side of it ideologically, and it just won 3 Emmys.
Yeah. It's true. It's hard to know what to make of that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
LA awards judges are not as woke as perhaps they would like to think they are, or
Yeah.
or maybe they're truly courageous. I would never have previously believed. One thing, there's a bit of a knot here where at the same time there is this chilling effect and there is the mob effect. It doesn't seem true that the range of acceptable opinion is now, or at least not universally true. White nationalists, they're not on the fringe. They have allies inside the Trump administration, and for the first time this cycle, most presidential candidates in the Democratic Party called for reparations. The sort of boundaries of the debate are expanding outward for good and ill. How could both of these phenomena be true at the same time, do you think?
Oh gosh. Can you, this is, well.
Or are they? I mean, maybe this is a false dichotomy, and that there is more chilling even as extremism is being welcomed. I don't have a theory here myself.
Yeah. Yes, they're finding kind of they've been, the far right are constantly surprising me in how clever they've been throughout all of this. For instance, just yesterday I was reading about how the people who created the whole QAnon conspiracy theory deliberately targeted Reddit, knowing that boomers on Reddit would be susceptible to paranoid conspiracy theories, which, I wrote a book about conspiracy theorists and, subjects I know a lot about, but it never crossed my mind for a second that Reddit boomers would all get swallowed up by QAnon. So they've been very, I know this didn't really answer your question, but I've just, time and again, they've outfoxed us in ways I found extremely surprising.
With that conundrum, I want to toss it open for questions. I'm sure a lot of people have opinions and thoughts about this. Is our administrator here to assess? Yes, looks like.
Hi, I'm the admin for ColumbiaDC's alumni group, So thank you so much, both of you. And we have a few questions coming in. If you are watching, you can still type those questions in and we will be asking them. And that is both for Ronson as well as for Adam. So our first
the first question, God, sorry, yes.
The first question from William Mooney Slonaker says, could you speak to how age does or does not justify public shaming? For instance, alleged perpetrators of sexual assault on high school or college campuses. And sometimes these cases reach very high profile and are tried in the media as well as the courts. So should young people be spared here, even if the offense is so severe?
I'd be interested to know what Adam says. I really deliberately stayed away from sexual assault stories in my book because I felt that it was not my place to write about that particular thing. So I don't have I'm really sorry for you. I mean, of course, I would say that the precedent has always been that people who are under the age of 18 don't get named in Britain, I think, but maybe I'm fuzzy-headed about that. Adam, will you save me from this question? I'm just very excited about the third question from anonymous attendee.
There's this, I'm sorry, I was fielding a text about my toddler who's having a meltdown because he can't participate, but did the questioner mention that there's this political candidate in Colorado who, as a very young man in high school, had said all of these sort of ridiculous trolling things about women and misogyny online, and then was now running for a seat. I don't remember if it's in Oklahoma or somewhere, Nebraska maybe. Now running for a seat in the state legislature as a Democrat, saying he's reformed and redeemed. But the question is especially relevant here. You know, it's certainly not my place to judge, although I, as the editor of a section populated by contributions from outside writers, have fielded lots of pitches from accused Me Too people and Me Too perpetrators, and figuring out when to take them seriously and when what they have to say is worth hearing is extraordinarily difficult. And, you know, everybody, of course, who's been through something like that has perpetrated sexual assault or been abusive in some way, has an incentive to say, mea maxima culpa, I have learned and been rehabilitated, accept me back into society. And so you have to be very cautious about that. Assessing that, for me, doesn't have any particular relationship to age. But yeah, I mean, sincerity is sort of what matters. I think the principle we discussed earlier in our talk about what does the victim say, you know, that's important. That's all I have to say about that.
Can we move up to that question at the top? Although I don't want to put you in any kind of difficult position, but I was fascinated in the Halloween.
Oh, what here? The question here is, what do you think of the Washington Post publishing the private identity of someone who attended their cartoonist party and wore iconic blackface as Megyn Kelly? She was then fired. This is, for those of you who don't know, the Post style section did a piece which was flayed online, in which see if I can remember all the details myself. A woman who had attended the Halloween house party of our staff cartoonist reported that she had seen another attendee there in blackface, and that later on, even years later maybe, when she confronted the cartoonist and homeowner about this, he supposedly protected the woman who had worn blackface. And the woman was found out. She was a federal government worker. She lost her job. And there was a question about news value and news judgment. Why was this an important story to tell right now? What were the stakes of it? I think those are fair questions to ask. I was not involved in the creation or reporting or editing of that story. I don't really think it's prudent or fair of me to sort of throw my colleagues under the bus or give really any opinion about it, which,
Sure.
you know, I would say that we have a very careful editing process for all sorts of things, especially accusations made against people for sort of cultural sins. The way we handle Me Too stories is extremely careful and thorough, which is why maybe some people might say we've done too finite a number of them. The same goes for things like this. That's not to say that those processes which we build so we can practice good journalism in good faith, that's not to say they're without flaws or that the editors who handle them don't sometimes make errors. That's what a lot of people held about this story. What's your thought, Jon?
Well, I mean, I found that whole incident fascinating in the same way that I felt that the Amy Cooper story was quite open and shut, that it wasn't fair to say that she hadn't done anything much wrong. I felt this story was quite open and shut in regards to how I felt it was a mistake. It was a fine, from memory, it was a fine idea. The idea was clearly that racism is so embedded into the fabric of our lives in a sort of white fragility type way that there was this Washington Post party where a woman turned up in blackface and nobody batted an eyelid. Now, personally, I think that if that was exactly what the story was, then there probably would be some value, because it would say something wider about, you know, a sort of Robin DiAngelo type thing. But as far as I can tell, that wasn't what the story actually was. She was a so she was a friend of a friend. Megyn Kelly had made some blackface comment that week, and so she wore blackface and wore a badge saying, "I am Megyn Kelly." So she got in the taxi, and the taxi driver said, I'm sorry, but I'm finding your costume offensive. And so by the time she got to the party, I think she was like feeling sort of prickly anxiety. And then a few people came up to her. I think a number of people came up to her at the party and said, I see what it is that you're trying to do, but it's really not working. It's really offensive. You've made a mistake. And she burst into tears, left the party, apologized to the host the next day, and then that was that. So given all of that, you know, I think it was a mistake to run the article, because all it did was bring it back after it felt like there'd been some resolution. She'd been in therapy for a year about it. I mean, it had really, you know, it had really haunted her. So given all of that context, I think the story was a mistake. Yeah, but you know, but I agree with you. I think, you know, last 4 years, like everybody, I've been, you know, very much enjoying the Post's coverage of the Trump administration, and it felt like a rare mistake, but nonetheless a mistake.
Great, we can move on. We have a question from the Columbia alumni president, I should say. We don't have Bollinger here. He asks, in your book, Jon, you talk about paid services that try to reclaim people's lives who've been shamed, and asks if you can talk, what do they do? How do they do it?
Right. Well, I talked about it a little bit before. It's all about trying to figure out the Google algorithm, which is apparently a constantly moving target. Google are apparently constantly tweaking their algorithm. So yeah, they charge an enormous amount of money. I mean, if Lindsay Stone had paid for their services, I think it would have come to several $100,000. But her transgression was all over the world. And by the way, it didn't work with her because her photograph was kind of everywhere. So it was just unburyable. But yeah, what they did was, it was quite simple. They set up, you know, using search terms and knowing how search engine optimization works and so on. They set up these fake accounts, fake blogs for her, and just try and push the transgression so far down the Google rankings that nobody notices it. So it's like it's PR mixed with understanding how algorithms work.
One question I had when I was reading the book actually was, so you say these Google algorithms consistently change. Does that mean that these companies, Reputation Defender and who take on these clients, have to kind of manage them for life? You know, is that part of the contract and services?
I know there's a lengthy amount of time where they sort of come back and do kind of aftercare. I think it's only going to work for a very select group of people. It's going to work for very wealthy people whose transgressions were were limited to one or two news sources. I think they can work wonders for those people, but not really for anyone else.
Can you give an example of somebody who got canceled that you thought shouldn't have, and that it was an overreaction, and what kind of sparks that overreaction?
The example John gave, I thought, was good. Aziz Ansari, the comedian, which I don't know if everybody remembers the way that episode unfolded, but a website ran a 4,000-word first-person essay by a woman who had had a very terrible, bizarre sexual encounter a night with him. And it was not an open and shut case of non-consensual sex, but there were weird things that had happened. And John, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it was. I wish I could remember the ins and outs. There was some, he was a bit coercive, if I remember rightly, more coercive than a person should be. But when the story broke, there was an immediate, no, this falls within the category of a bad date, as opposed to
right.
So that seemed to be the consensus.
And it was an interesting. I mean, he wasn't the first kind of target of Me Too who was an open political progressive and feminist, but I wonder if that gave him some additional armor to say, well, this isn't me or whatever.
No, I don't think so. Because I don't think so. I mean, beloved people have fallen. I mean, Louis C.K. And
Al Franken.
Al Franken, who I see from time to time. I think his kids live on the next street to me in that a place in Manhattan, and I see him looking just heroic,
bereft,
yeah, just broken,
yeah,
padding around the Upper West Side.
That was an interesting case because targeting him in what was already a disputed circumstance meant also a surrender of power by the progressive left, or at least a potential surrender of power. He was replaced ultimately by another Democrat, I think. So
yeah, it was that felt like perhaps if that had happened at another moment in history, even maybe another moment that year, the outcome might have been different. That felt like an overreaction. And that feels like the consensus. But I think these stories do show that Me Too has been good at, has been pretty good at self-policing for an organisation that came together the way that it did. It actually surprised me. It was a surprise to me that there was so much backlash against the Aziz Ansari article, because it wasn't cut and dry. It was still a complicated story about a bad date.
Absolutely.
But people were really adamant, like, no, this does Me Too a disservice.
Well, maybe we can move now to the EU. They have a law called Right to be Forgotten. And somebody asks where you can be deleted off of the internet. Should we have something like that in America? Right.
So the Right to be Forgotten, that was just starting, I think, just as I was leaving the UK. It was for people who, one of the very first people who cited the law was this couple who had sex on a train, and they evoked the Right to be Forgotten, and it got taken off the internet, the film of them having sex on the train. My views really changed as a result of writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed. I mean, my gut feeling as a journalist would be the Right to be Forgotten sounds terrible, because of course powerful people are going to use it to get away with abuses of power. But since writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed and meeting the likes of Justine Sacco and Lindsay Stone, I just had a lot more sympathy with people like the couple who had sex on a train, where I think, you know what, fine, I don't have a problem with it.
Of course, what we need is some kind of Google rabbi who can come in and weigh these cases and say, well, this is justice and these people were stupid, and a lifetime of shame is disproportionate to their crime. But on the other hand, the banker who embezzled millions of dollars, or the Deutsche official who financed the Trump administration, the Trump family's expansion, like, should not get the right to be forgotten. But of course, that's impossible.
I'm pretty sure in my book I detail a little bit of the criteria of the right to be forgotten, but I fear that if I get my book out and start leafing through it, it's going to be a really dull 5 minutes. But I think there is criteria.
Regulatory policy in the European Union, important subject for this evening's talk.
Well, exactly. But there hasn't been, or I haven't seen stories of the right to be forgotten has been misused. So as far as I know, the right to be forgotten has been a pretty successful and uncontroversial law in the UK and in the EU. But again, like, I'm not all over that, and there may well be stories that refute what I just said. But to my knowledge, that's the case, because it was all about private individuals who had committed a single transgression and so on.
And so I think most of our audience members today are American. So let's say that they somehow get shamed publicly, probably a smaller transgression than some of the cases you brought up. But in your book, you talk about a British racing magnate who was able to handle the tabloid stories. So how might somebody who maybe gets some attention on Twitter or something like that, what can they do to help themselves?
Right. Well, the racing magnate, that story turns out to be an extremely prescient story, because that was in like 2014, I think, or 2013. I was talking to this guy. So he's called Max Mosley. He's kind of like a Ralph Nader of Britain in terms of car safety. His big thing has been car safety. However, his father was Britain's leading fascist, Oswald Mosley. Very terrible head of the British Union of Fascists. So one day Max Mosley, picks up the newspaper, and the cover is Oswald Mosley's son in sick Nazi orgy. And he'd been secretly filmed in an orgy which the News of the World contended was Nazi themed. And Max Mosley, after initially feeling obviously suicidally embarrassed, thought, you know what, I'm not going to be embarrassed about this. Everybody knows that when it comes to sex, people do and say and think strange things, and in fact the idiots are the people who pretend that that's not the case. And this orgy was entirely consensual, and most importantly of all, it was German themed but not Nazi themed. So Max Mosley took them to court, and for weeks, frame by frame, they were asked to point out the Nazism, is there a swastika in this picture? And there were no swastikas. It was Germanic, not Nazi. So he won, and for a while became a kind of hero. He said to me something extraordinary, which was our shame was gone.
No, he had the truth on his side, which not everybody who is publicly shamed does.
And he had the money to prove the truth. He was a rich man, so he could afford to take the tabloid to court, which helped an awful lot. And it was a consensual sex scandal. And these days, especially if you're a man, but I'd say not uniquely if you're a man, a consensual sex scandal is pretty low down on the list of destroyable offences. But beyond all of that, his refusal, he said, if he said that it's a pact between, a shaming is a pact between the shamed and the shamers. And if the shamed step out of the pact by refusing to feel ashamed, then the whole thing crumbles.
Of course, that brings us back to Trump.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why I say that story was so inadvertently prescient, because that's what's happened. And it's, and that's what I mean when I said that I think one inadvertent byproduct of our overuse of shame is like bugs mutating to become hospital superbugs. Shamed people are mutating to become impervious to shame, like Trump and Max Mosley, and that is synonymous with behaving in a more psychopathic manner.
We have another question that came in from Eve. And it says, should attending to the experiences of people shamed on social media also shift how traditional media cover crime? And there's a bit of a difference here between mugshots versus, funny stories about the Florida man crashing alligator sled into strip bar, but they can be very dehumanizing. So both of you, do you have any thoughts on whether the news itself can be made more empathetic to screw-ups and certain wrongdoers?
Sure. Well, actually, I in my previous book, The Psychopath Test, I write about people who took their lives after being on bad reality TV shows. In fact, in The Psychopath Test, I interviewed a woman who was a guest booker for shows like Jerry Springer, and she had a secret trick that she would utilize when deciding which guests to book. And her secret trick was that she would ask them what medication they were on. And if they were on a medication for something, she said, again, this wasn't an exact science, if they were on a medication for something scary sounding like lithium, she said she wouldn't put them on the show because you didn't want them to go on the show and then go off and kill themselves. She said, but if they were on a medication that implied a kind of fun-sounding mental illness like Prozac, that's perfect. It means that they're anxious and depressed, but they're not so depressed that, it could be...
My God, the pharmacological proxy for TV bookers.
I know, right?
Insane.
It's an extraordinary thing that she did. It wasn't sanctioned, I should say. It was an informal thing that did. So yes, Twitter often sees itself as better than the tabloids, but very often on Twitter we act just like the tabloids, reducing people to a sliver of their lives, defining them by this one moment and so on. So yeah, I feel as uncomfortable about these sort of dehumanizing, exploitative shows as the question that
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at this one too. I think, there are a few distinctions to draw. One is between reputable news organizations and not reputable entertainment organizations. I would not put, the Washington Post or the Guardian or the Times or whatever in the same category as the Jerry Springer show. Another distinction to draw is on what is relevant and what the stakes are. In journalism, we use a sort of shorthand, a device we call news judgment. Is it important to our readers? Is it relevant to our readers? What are the stakes? In this case, the value of the Washington Post publishing a story about Florida man on an alligator sled having a stupid accident is very low, which is why we don't do it. Now, I think you could maybe make the case for his local weekly, if God help us, such things even still exist. It's a reasonably good test for, is this news organization a serious place? If you see kind of entertaining news of the weird, relevant or not, versus like, is this a story that makes sense for this place to tell to its readers?
Oh, and by the way, going back to my guest booker for shows like Jerry Springer, when I was asking her more about her medication picks, she said, what you're looking for? She said, you don't want actual exploitation, you want smoke and mirrors exploitation, was her way of putting it.
Quite clever.
Sure.
Quite sophisticated. Yeah.
Yes. But it made me think that maybe what we want out of people falling apart on Jerry Springer is that we want people who are a little bit crazier than we are, not so crazy that we feel bad about enjoying the spectacle, just a bit crazier than we are. So because we're all worried that we're going crazy. So maybe it soothes us to see somebody on television who's a little bit crazier than we are.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And maybe that's also the truth for Twitter. Maybe like when Amy Cooper happens, everyone's like, wow, we'll get her because we're afraid,
Right. There, but for the grace of God.
Yeah.
Let me postulate one more axiom along those lines. I wonder if it's the case, I wonder if you'd agree with this, that it's now, we're decades into reality TV and news of the weird and the internet making fun of randos doing, stupid things, that I wonder if the ramifications for our archetypal Florida man are as high. He alligator sledded into a Denny's, and there's so many examples of Florida man, alligator sledding into a Denny's or the equivalent, that his crime may be forgotten extremely quickly, and he may not be the victim of a national blacklist or shaming.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Yeah, I know that was I'm sorry, but that was a brief answer to a very excellent point. Question.
And if we could maybe postulate to the future, if you could, what do you think that the public shaming of the future might be? And what kind of course might it? I mean, we have all these new technologies now, so is there something new that might come out that would make this easier or harder?
Black Mirror territory.
Right. Yeah. That's a hard question to answer because it feels like it's constantly mutating. I felt when I was writing So You've Been Publicly Shamed, I was documenting a time when social media was essentially a toddler crawling towards a gun. I feel we're beyond that now. Maybe we're now maybe social media is now in its adolescence, and everyone's yelling at each other in that because of that. So maybe we'll grow up. Maybe a newer generation. Going back to the whole QAnon thing, actually, I found it very interesting that one of the reasons why the QAnon creators were targeting Reddit was because they theorized correctly that the boomers of Reddit, were didn't understand how the internet worked as well as young people did. They couldn't tell truth from fiction as well as young people can, and so on. So I guess extrapolating from that, perhaps the younger generation who will have been born into a world of public shaming, unlike people like us who had to adapt to a new world uneasily. Who knows, perhaps it will settle down a little bit because they've been born into this, and so the whole thing about Justine Sacco, one of the reasons why Justine Sacco became such an enormous thing was because it was so new. It was the shock of the new. So maybe when the shock dies down a little bit.
My view differs a little bit from yours here. I think, I wouldn't offer a projection for the long term, but I think at least in the near term, insofar as cancel culture has bled into shame culture, I see all sorts of things, local high school Instagram groups, people making fun of other students, local officials. I see a lot more shaming now, and people sort of anointing themselves. Sorry, a lot of times this phrase is used judgingly, but I don't mean it that way here. Appointing themselves social justice warriors and righteous condemners of the stupid racist thing that some 16-year-old high school student said, which should be condemned, but maybe not to 2 million followers of some famous person's Instagram or Twitter account or whatever. I do see that kind of thing happening a lot more.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I was being overly optimistic.
Your mileage may vary.
But you're probably right.
I think it's also just interesting that the younger generation is now, they grew up with full access to technologies. They have phones at super young ages. So their access to a wider audience is different from the older generation who got technology at a later age and so might have limited what they put out there. But this younger generation coming in is just putting everything out there and maybe are less able to be shamed because they don't feel shame in what they're putting out there.
Yeah, I made a show called The Butterfly Effect about the porn industry post Pornhub. Basically, it was about the tech takeover, the consequences of the tech takeover of the porn industry. And yeah, one thing I discovered was that the San Fernando Valley is filled with young women trying to make it in porn in an unprecedented way for the reasons that you just said, that they've grown up with Pornhub and porn no longer feels to them like a kind of Bonnie and Clyde type thing. You get into porn, you're going to be marked for life. It's now much more normal for them. And as a consequence, the valley's flooded with them. They get way less work because there's so many of them. And then they return to their regular lives. and quite possibly in 10 years' time, they'll become a high school teacher, and the HR officer will see one of their films on Pornhub, and their lives will be ruined, not by the porn industry, but by the hypocrisies of the outside world. So that story, I think that's a complicated story because, on the one hand, it means that young people are, there's less stigma about sex than there was in my generation. But on the other hand, that's another landmine that's being planted. What's going to happen to all of these people in 10, 15 years' time?
And then a question for Adam. Since you work at Washington Post, it is a business after all. There's a lot of talk now about how article, especially titles, need to generate clicks. And so that can influence what is put out there. And do you have any comments on that?
Yes. Clickbait is a thing. It especially was a thing. There were, I would say, 18 months in the life of the internet from around 2010 to 2012 when a lot of organizations were putting completely irresponsible overselling headlines onto stories that didn't merit them. Mostly the reputable places recovered from that pretty quickly and realized, kind of established some principles. The kinds of things we follow now are the headline has to accurately represent what is contained in the story. The major places I think you can count on not to publish what was once called clickbait. Now, I think the term is often misused to mean pieces that are entertaining. And we do publish entertaining pieces, essays, people who have odd experiences they want to write about. And I'll see comments on stories. Oh, this is clickbait. Why is the Washington Post writing about, this person's experience of giving a home birth or whatever strange thing? I don't think that's a correct appellation, the correct use of the term there. And I think that kind of story is absolutely justified to run if it is, harnessing some kind of trend or some, if it has news value, if according to news judgment it's merited. There is still clickbait out there at some of the less worthy places, and it's unfortunate. Gives places like John's and mine, a bad rap.
And then maybe just some closing thoughts on how can we ourselves in our social online presences, how can we be better? What can we do to just make sure that we aren't accidentally doing something that might influence somebody's lives in a negative way?
Oh, and by the way, I just realized I never answered the question about what to do if you're shamed. So one of the things you can do if you really don't think you've done anything wrong is that Max Mosley type approach of but I think that only works in a very small number of situations, and ought to only work in a small number of situations, because I think we should feel shame when we've done something bad. Our society needs shame. I think if you've done something wrong, I think the thing to do is apologize. You'll have a million people pulling apart your apology, because in much the same way that after 9/11 conspiracy theorists were suddenly structural engineers all holding forth on how buildings are supposed to fall, these days everybody's a linguist, passing apologies for clues to their inauthenticity. But I also think that if you don't feel like you've done anything wrong, fight back. And I think it's probably a little bit easier to fight back now than it would have been a few years ago. In terms of closing thoughts, on patience and curiosity are the two things I would advocate, especially when it comes to Twitter shamings, because very frequently we've torn somebody to shreds for something that it turns out a couple of days later they just didn't do. So I would say that people shouldn't, if people could refrain from tearing somebody to shreds for 2 days after the transgression, that would help, because within 2 days, I'm sure more information will come out contextually about the transgression. In actual courts, it's sentencing hearings.
To that point, you had a line in the book that really stuck with me. Hold on, can you hold on 1 second? which is that the snowflake never needs to feel responsible for the avalanche. And I mean, it's just echoing the point you just made, but I think that metaphor will stick with me. It was a very good one.
That's why most of my books, the thing I want to do more than anything else is to be funny. But in this book, I wanted people to really feel the anxiety. I wanted to write like a Blair Witch Project. I wanted people to feel what it felt like to be Justine Sacco. And it was for that reason, because, you know, the drone strike operator doesn't need to think about the village, and the snowflake doesn't need to be responsible for the avalanche. So I thought the one thing I could give the world with that book is that feeling of prickling terror that happens when you're at the bottom of a pylon. I wanted people to feel what that felt like for that reason, so the snowflake can feel more responsible.
I think this was our last question. Thanks, John. Thanks, Adam. Any final words before we call it? But I just want to add that we're going to have a recording of this posted after processing within 24 hours. So we'll post it on YouTube. Any final thoughts?
No, I hope everybody got something out of it, and I hope it was fun for people.
All right. Thank you so much. We'll looking forward to hopefully redo this again.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much, Adam, for wanting to do this.
Yeah, and great to talk to you, John.
Okay, bye.